The Warrior's Soul, a short story by Joseph Conrad. The old officer with long white moustaches gave rein to his indignation. Is it possible that you youngsters should have no more sense than that? Some of you had better wipe the milk off your upper lip before you start to pass judgment on the few poor stragglers of a generation which has done and suffered not a little in its time. His hearers having expressed much compunction, the ancient warrior became appeased, but he was not silenced. I am one of them. One of the stragglers, I mean, he went on patiently. And what did we do? What have we achieved? He, the great Napoleon, started upon us to emulate the Macedonian Alexander with a ruck of nations at his back. We opposed empty spaces to French impetuosity. Then we offered them an interminable battle so that their army went at last to sleep in its positions, lying down on the heaps of its own dead. Then came the wall of fire in Moscow. It toppled down on them. Then began the long rout of the Grand Army. I have seen it stream on, like the doomed flight of haggard, spectral sinners across the innermost frozen circle of Dante's Inferno, ever widening before their despairing eyes. They who escaped must have had their souls doubly riveted inside their bodies to carry them out of Russia through that frost fit to split rocks. But to say that it was our fault that a single one of them got away is mere ignorance. Why? Our own men suffered nearly to the limit of their strength, their Russian strength. Of course our spirit was not broken, and then our cause was good, it was holy, but that did not temper the wind much to men and horses. The flesh is weak. Good or evil purpose, humanity has to pay the price. Why? In that very fight for that little village of which I've been telling you, we were fighting for the shelter of those old houses as much as victory. And with the French, it was the same. It wasn't for the sake of glory or for the sake of strategy. The French knew that they would have to retreat before morning, and we knew perfectly well that they would go. As far as the war was concerned, there was nothing to fight about. Yet our infantry and theirs fought like wild cats, or like heroes, if you like that better, amongst the houses, hot work enough, while the supports out in the open stood freezing in a tempestuous north wind, which drove the snow on earth and the great masses of clouds in the sky at a terrific pace. The very air was inexpressibly somber by contrast with the white earth. I have never seen God's creation look more sinister than on that day. We, the cavalry, we were only a handful, had not much to do except turn our backs to the wind and receive some stray French round shot. This, I may tell you, was the last of the French guns, and it was the last time they had their artillery in position. Those guns never went away from there either. We found them abandoned next morning. But that afternoon they were keeping up an infernal fire on our attacking column. The furious wind carried away the smoke and even the noise. But we could see the constant flicker of the tongues of fire along the French front. Then a driving flurry of snow would hide everything except the dark red flashes in the white swirl. At intervals when the line cleared, we could see away across the plain to the right a somber column moving endlessly, the great rout of the Grand Army creeping on and on all the time, while the fight on our left went on with a great din and fury. The cruel whirlwind of snow swept over that scene of death and desolation, and then the wind fell as suddenly as it had arisen in the morning. Presently, we got orders to charge the retreating column. I don't know why, unless they wanted to prevent us from getting frozen in our saddles by giving us something to do. We changed front half right and got into motion at a walk to take that distant dark line in flank. It might have been 2:30 in the afternoon. You must know that so far in this campaign, my regiment had never been on the main line of Napoleon's advance. All these months since the invasion, the army we belonged to had been wrestling with Oudinot in the north. We had only come down lately, driving him before us to the Beresina. This was the first occasion, then, that I and my comrades had a close view of Napoleon's Grand Army. It was an amazing and terrible sight. I had heard of it from others. I had seen the stragglers from it, small bands of marauders, parties of prisoners in the distance. But this was the very column itself, a crawling, stumbling, starved, half-demented mob. It issued from the forest a mile away, and its head was lost in the murk of the fields. We rode into it at a trot, which was the most we could get out of our horses, and we stuck in that human mass as if in a moving bog. There was no resistance. I heard a few shots, half a dozen perhaps. Their very senses seemed frozen within them. I had time for a good look while riding at the head of my squadron. Well, I assure you, there were men walking on the outer edge so lost to everything but their misery that they never turned their heads to look at our charge. Soldiers! My horse pushed over one of them with his chest. The poor wretch had a dragoon's blue cloak, all torn and scorched, hanging from his shoulders, and he didn't even put his hand out to snatch at my bridle and save himself. He just went down. Our troopers were pointing and slashing. Well, and of course at first I myself. What would you have? An enemy's an enemy. Yet a sort of sickening awe crept into my heart. There was no tumult, only a low, deep murmur dwelt over them, interspersed with louder cries and groans, while that mob kept on pushing and surging past us, sightless and without feeling. A smell of scorched rags and festering wounds hung in the air. My horse staggered in the eddies of swaying men, but it was like cutting down galvanized corpses that didn't care. Invaders. Yes, God was already dealing with them. I touched my horse with the spurs to get clear. There was a sudden rush and a sort of angry moan when our second squadron got into them on our right. My horse plunged, and somebody got hold of my leg. As I had no mind to get pulled out of the saddle, I gave a backhanded slash without looking. I heard a cry, and my leg was let go suddenly. Just then I caught sight of the subaltern of my troop at some little distance from me. His name was Tomassov. That multitude of resurrected bodies with glassy eyes was seething round his horse as if blind, growling crazily. He was sitting erect in his saddle, not looking down at them, and sheathing his sword deliberately. This Tomassov, well, he had a beard. Of course we all had beards then. Circumstances, lack of leisure, want of razors too. No, seriously, we were a wild-looking lot in those unforgotten days, which so very many of us did not survive. You know our losses were awful too. Yes, we looked wild. Des Russes sauvages. What? So he had a beard, this Tomassov, I mean, but he did not look savage. He was the youngest of us all, and that meant real youth. At a distance he passed muster fairly well, what with the grime and the particular stamp of that campaign on our faces. But directly, you were near enough to have a good look into his eyes. That was where his lack of age showed, though he was not exactly a boy. Those same eyes were blue, something like the blue of autumn skies, dreamy and gay, too, innocent, believing eyes. A topknot of fair hair decorated his brow like a gold diadem in what one would call normal times. You may think I am talking of him as if he were the hero of a novel. Why, that's nothing to what the adjutant discovered about him. He discovered that he had a lover's lips, whatever that may be. If the adjutant meant a nice mouth, why, it was nice enough, but of course it was intended for a sneer. That adjutant of ours was not a very delicate fellow. "Look at those lover's lips," he would exclaim in a loud tone while Tomassov was talking. Tomassov didn't quite like that sort of thing, but to a certain extent he had laid himself open to banter by the lasting character of his impressions, which were connected with the passion of love, and perhaps were not of such a rare kind as he seemed to think them. What made his comrades tolerant of his rhapsodies was the fact that they were connected with France, with Paris. You of the present generation, you cannot conceive how much prestige there was then in those names for the whole world. Paris was the center of wonder for all human beings gifted with imagination. There we were, the majority of us young and well-connected, but not long out of our hereditary nests in the provinces, simple servants of God, mere rustics, if I may say so. So we were only too ready to listen to the tales of France from our comrade Tomassov. He had been attached to our mission in Paris the year before the war, high protections very likely, or maybe sheer luck. I don't think he could have been a very useful member of the mission because of his youth and complete inexperience, and apparently all his time in Paris was his own. The use he made of it was to fall in love, to remain in that state, to cultivate it, to exist only for it, in a manner of speaking. Thus it was something more than a mere memory that he had brought with him from France. Memory is a fugitive thing. It can be falsified, it can be effaced, it can be even doubted. Why? I myself come to doubt sometimes that I, too, have been in Paris in my turn. And the long road there, with battles for its stages, would appear still more incredible if it were not for a certain musket ball which I have been carrying about my person ever since a little cavalry affair which happened in Silesia at the very beginning of the Leipzig campaign. Passages of love, however, are more impressive, perhaps, than passages of danger. You don't go affronting love in troops, as it were. They are rarer, more personal, and more intimate. And remember that with Tomassov, all that was very fresh yet. He had not been home from France 3 months when the war began. His heart, his mind, were full of that experience. He was really awed by it, and he was simple enough to let it appear in his speeches. He considered himself a sort of privileged person, not because a woman had looked at him with favor, but simply because, how shall I say it, he had had the wonderful illumination of his worship for her, as if it were heaven itself that had done this for him. Oh yes, he was very simple, a nice youngster yet no fool, and with that, utterly inexperienced, unsuspicious and unthinking. You will find one like that here and there in the provinces. He had some poetry in him too. It could only be natural, something quite his own, not acquired. I suppose Father Adam had some poetry in him of that natural sort. For the rest, un russe sauvage, as the French sometimes call us, but not of that kind which they maintain eats tallow candle for a delicacy. As to the woman, the French woman, well, though I have also been in France with 100,000 Russians, I have never seen her. Very likely she was not in Paris then, and in any case, hers were not the doors that would fly open before simple fellows of my sort, you understand. Gilded salons were never in my way. I could not tell you how she looked, which is strange considering that I was, if I may say so, Tomassov's special confidant. He very soon got shy of talking before the others. I suppose the usual campfire comments jarred his fine feelings. But I was left to him, and truly I had to submit. You can't very well expect a youngster in Tomassov's state to hold his tongue altogether. And I suppose you will hardly believe me, I am by nature a rather silent sort of person. Very likely my silence appeared to him sympathetic. All the month of September, our regiment, quartered in villages, had come in for an easy time. It was then that I heard most of that. You can't call it a story. The story I have in my mind is not in that. Outpourings, let us call them. I would sit quite content to hold my peace, a whole hour perhaps, while Tomassov talked with exultation, and when he was done, I would still hold my peace, and then there would be produced a solemn effect of silence which, I imagine, pleased Tomassov in a way. She was, of course, not a woman in her first youth. A widow, maybe. At any rate, I never heard Tomassov mention her husband. She had a salon, something very distinguished, a social centre in which she queened it with great splendour. Somehow I fancy her court was composed mostly of men. But Tomassov, I must say, kept such details out of his discourses wonderfully well. Upon my word, I don't know whether her hair was dark or fair, her eyes brown or blue, what was her stature, her features, or her complexion. His love soared above mere physical impressions. He never described her to me in set terms, but he was ready to swear that in her presence Everybody's thoughts and feelings were bound to circle round her. She was that sort of woman. Most wonderful conversations on all sorts of subjects went on in her salon. But through them all, there flowed unheard like a mysterious strain of music, the assertion, the power, the tyranny of sheer beauty. So apparently, the woman was beautiful. She detached all these talking people from their life interests and even from their vanities. She was a secret delight and a secret trouble. All the men, when they looked at her, fell to brooding as if struck by the thought that their lives had been wasted. She was the very joy and shudder of felicity, and she brought only sadness and torment to the hearts of men. In short, she must have been an extraordinary woman, or else Tomassov was an extraordinary young fellow to feel in that way and to talk like this about her. I told you the fellow had a lot of poetry in him, and observed that all this sounded true enough. It would be just about the sorcery a woman very much out of the common would exercise, you know. Poets do get close to truth somehow. There is no denying that. There is no poetry in my composition, I know, but I have my share of common shrewdness, and I have no doubt that the lady was kind to the youngster, once he did find his way inside her salon. His getting in is the real marvel. However, he did get in, the innocent, and he found himself in distinguished company there amongst men of considerable position. And you know what that means. Thick waists, bald heads, teeth that are not, as some satirist puts it. Imagine amongst them a nice boy, fresh and simple, like an apple just off the tree, a modest, good-looking, impressionable, adoring young barbarian. My word. What a change! What a relief for jaded feelings, and with that, having in his nature that dose of poetry which saves even a simpleton from being a fool. He became an artlessly, unconditionally devoted slave. He was rewarded by being smiled on and in time admitted to the intimacy of the house. It may be that the unsophisticated young barbarian amused the exquisite lady. Perhaps, since he didn't feed on tallow candles, he satisfied some need of tenderness in the woman. You know, there are many kinds of tenderness highly civilized women are capable of. Women with heads and imagination, I mean, and no temperament to speak of, you understand. But who is going to fathom their needs or their fancies? Most of the time, they themselves don't know much about their innermost moods and blunder out of one into another, sometimes with catastrophic results. And then who is more surprised than they? However, Tomassov's case was in its nature quite idyllic. The fashionable world was amused. His devotion made for him a kind of social success. But he didn't care. There was his one divinity, and there was the shrine where he was permitted to go in and out without regard for official reception hours. He took advantage of that privilege freely. Well, he had no official duties, you know. The military mission was supposed to be more complimentary than anything else, the head of it being a personal friend of our Emperor Alexander. And he, too, was laying himself out for successes in fashionable life exclusively, as it seemed. As it seemed. One afternoon, Tomassov called on the mistress of his thoughts earlier than usual. She was not alone. There was a man with her, not one of the thick-waisted, bald-headed personages, but a somebody all the same, a man over 30, a French officer who, to some extent, was also a privileged intimate. Tomassov was not jealous of him. Such a sentiment would have appeared presumptuous to the simple fellow. On the contrary, he admired that officer. You have no idea of the French military men's prestige in those days, even with us Russian soldiers who had managed to face them perhaps better than the rest. Victory had marked them on the forehead. It seemed forever. They would have been more than human if they had not been conscious of it, but they were good comrades, and had a sort of brotherly feeling for all who bore arms, even if it was against them. And this was quite a superior example, an officer of the Major General's staff, and a man of the best society besides. He was powerfully built and thoroughly masculine, though he was as carefully groomed as a woman. He had the courteous self-possession of a man of the world. His forehead, white as alabaster, contrasted impressively with the healthy color of his face. I don't know whether he was jealous of Tomasov, but I suspect that he might have been a little annoyed at him as at a sort of walking absurdity of the sentimental order. But these men of the world are impenetrable, and outwardly he condescended to recognize Tomasov's existence even more distinctly than was strictly necessary. Once or twice he had offered him some useful worldly advice with perfect tact and delicacy. Tomasov was completely conquered by that evidence of kindness under the cold polish of the best society. Tomasov, introduced into the petit salon, found these two exquisite people sitting on a sofa together and had the feeling of having interrupted some special conversation. They looked at him strangely, he thought, but he was not given to understand that he had intruded. After a time, the lady said to the officer, his name was de Castel, "I wish you would take the trouble to ascertain the exact truth as to that rumor." "It's much more than a mere rumor," remarked the officer, but he got up submissively and went out. The lady turned to Tomasov and said, "You may stay with me." This express command made him supremely happy, though as a matter of fact he had had no idea of going. She regarded him with her kindly glances, which made something glow and expand within his chest. It was a delicious feeling, even though it did cut one's breath short now and then. Ecstatically, he drank in the sound of her tranquil, seductive talk, full of innocent gaiety and of spiritual quietude. His passion appeared to him to flame up and envelop her in blue, fiery tongues from head to foot and over her head, while her soul reposed in the center like a big white rose. Good this. He told me many other things like that, but this is the one I remember. He himself remembered everything because these were the last memories of that woman. He was seeing her for the last time, though he did not know it then. Monsieur de Castel returned, breaking into that atmosphere of enchantment Tomassov had been drinking in, even to complete unconsciousness of the external world. Tomassov could not help being struck by the distinction of his movements, the ease of his manner, his superiority to all the other men he knew, and he suffered from it. It occurred to him that these two brilliant beings on the sofa were made for each other. De Castel, sitting down by the side of the lady, murmured to her discreetly, "There is not the slightest doubt that it's true," and they both turned their eyes to Tomasov. Roused thoroughly from his enchantment, he became self-conscious. A feeling of shyness came over him. He sat smiling faintly at them. The lady, without taking her eyes off the blushing Tomasov, said with a dreamy gravity quite unusual to her, "I should like to know that your generosity can be supreme, without a flaw. Love at its highest should be the origin of every perfection." Tomasov opened his eyes wide with admiration at this, as though her lips had been dropping real pearls. The sentiment, however, was not uttered for the primitive Russian youth, but for the exquisitely accomplished man of the world, de Castel. Tomasov could not see the effect it produced, because the French officer lowered his head and sat there, contemplating his admirably polished boots. The lady whispered in a sympathetic tone, "You have scruples?" De Castel, without looking up, murmured, "It could be turned into a nice point of honor." She said vivaciously, "That surely is artificial. I am all for natural feelings. I believe in nothing else. But perhaps your conscience—" He interrupted her. "Not at all. My conscience is not childish. The fate of those people is of no military importance to us. What can it matter? The fortune of France is invincible." "Well, then," she uttered meaningly, and rose from the couch. The French officer stood up too. Tomasov hastened to follow their example. He was pained by his state of utter mental darkness. While he was raising the lady's white hand to his lips, he heard the French officer say with marked emphasis, "If he has the soul of a warrior—" At that time, you know, People really talked in that way. If he has the soul of a warrior, he ought to fall at your feet in gratitude. Tomasov felt himself plunged into even denser darkness than before. He followed the French officer out of the room and out of the house, for he had a notion that this was expected of him. It was getting dusk, the weather was very bad, and the street was quite deserted. The Frenchman lingered in it strangely, and Tomassov lingered, too, without impatience. He was never in a hurry to get away from the house in which she lived, and besides, something wonderful had happened to him. The hand he had reverently raised by the tips of its fingers had been pressed against his lips. He had received a secret favor. He was almost frightened. The world had reeled, and it had hardly steadied itself yet. De Castell stopped short at the corner of the quiet street. "I don't care to be seen too much with you in the lighted thoroughfares, Monsieur Tomassov," he said in a strangely grim tone. "Why?" asked the young man, too startled to be offended. "From prudence," answered the other curtly. "So we will have to part here. But before we part, I'll disclose to you something of which you will see at once the importance." This, please note, was an evening in late March of the year 1812. For a long time already, there had been talk of a growing coolness between Russia and France. The word war was being whispered in drawing-rooms louder and louder, and at last was heard in official circles. Thereupon, the Parisian police discovered that our military envoy had corrupted some clerks at the Ministry of War and had obtained from them some very important confidential documents. The wretched men, there were 2 of them, had confessed their crime and were to be shot that night. Tomorrow, all the town would be talking of the affair. But the worst was that the Emperor Napoleon was furiously angry at the discovery and had made up his mind to have the Russian envoy arrested. Such was de Castell's disclosure, and though he had spoken in low tones, Tomassov was stunned as by a great crash. "Arrested," he murmured desolately. "Yes, and kept as a state prisoner, with everybody belonging to him." The French officer seized Tomassov's arm above the elbow and pressed it hard. "And kept in France," he repeated into Tomassov's very ear, and then letting him go, stepped back a space and remained silent. "And it's you, who are telling me this," cried Tomassov in an extremity of gratitude that was hardly greater than his admiration for the generosity of his future foe. Could a brother have done for him more? He sought to seize the hand of the French officer, but the latter remained wrapped up closely in his cloak. Possibly in the dark, he had not noticed the attempt. He moved back a bit, and in his self-possessed voice of a man of the world, as though he were speaking across a card table or something of the sort, he called Tomassov's attention to the fact that if he meant to make use of the warning, the moments were precious. "Indeed they are," agreed the awed Tomassov. "Goodbye, then. I have no word of thanks to equal your generosity, but if ever I have an opportunity, I swear it, you may command my life." But the Frenchman retreated, had already vanished in the dark, lonely street. Tomassov was alone, and then he did not waste any of the precious minutes of that night. See how people's mere gossip and idle talk pass into history. In all the memoirs of the time, if you read them, you will find it stated that our envoy had a warning from some highly placed woman who was in love with him. Of course, it's known that he had successes with women, and in the highest spheres too, but the truth is that the person who warned him was no other than our simple Tomassov, an altogether different sort of lover from himself. This, then, is the secret of our emperor's representative's escape from arrest. He and all his official household got out of France all right, as history records. And amongst that household there was our Tomassov, of course. He had, in the words of the French officer, the soul of a warrior. And what more desolate prospect for a man with such a soul than to be imprisoned on the eve of war, to be cut off from his country in danger, from his military family, from his duty, from honor, and, Well, from glory too. Tomassov used to shudder at the mere thought of the moral torture he had escaped, and he nursed in his heart a boundless gratitude to the two people who had saved him from that cruel ordeal. They were wonderful. For him, love and friendship were but two aspects of exalted perfection. He had found these fine examples of it, and he vowed them indeed a sort of cult. It affected his attitude towards Frenchmen in general, great patriot as he was. He was naturally indignant at the invasion of his country, but this indignation had no personal animosity in it. His was fundamentally a fine nature. He grieved at the appalling amount of human suffering he saw around him. Yes, he was full of compassion for all forms of mankind's misery in a manly way. Less fine natures than his own did not understand this very well. In the regiment, they had nicknamed him the humane Tomassov. He didn't take offense at it. There is nothing incompatible between humanity and a warrior's soul. People without compassion are the civilians, government officials, merchants, and such like. As to the ferocious talk one hears from a lot of decent people in wartime, well, the tongue is an unruly member at best, and when there is some excitement going on, there is no curbing its furious activity. So I had not been very surprised to see our Tomasov sheathe deliberately his sword right in the middle of that charge, you may say. As we rode away after it, he was very silent. He was not a chatterer as a rule, but it was evident that this close view of the Grand Army had affected him deeply, like some sight not of this earth. I had always been a pretty tough individual myself. Well, even I. And there was that fellow with a lot of poetry in his nature. You may imagine what he made of it to himself. We rode side by side without opening our lips. It was simply beyond words. We established our bivouac along the edge of the forest so as to get some shelter for our horses. However, the boisterous north wind had dropped as quickly as it had sprung up, and the great winter stillness lay on the land from the Baltic to the Black Sea. One could almost feel its cold, lifeless immensity reaching up to the stars. Our men had lighted several fires for their officers and had cleared the snow around them. We had big logs of wood for seats. It was a very tolerable bivouac upon the whole, even without the exultation of victory. We were to feel that later, but at present we were oppressed by our stern and arduous task. There were three of us round my fire. The third one was that adjutant. He was perhaps a well-meaning chap, but not so nice as he might have been, had he been less rough in manner and less crude in his perceptions. He would reason about people's conduct as though a man were as simple a figure as, say, two sticks laid across each other, whereas a man is much more like the sea, whose movements are too complicated to explain, and whose depths may bring up God only knows what at any moment. We talked a little about that charge, not much. That sort of thing does not lend itself to conversation. Tomassov muttered a few words about a mere butchery. I had nothing to say. As I told you, I had very soon let my sword hang idle at my wrist. That starving mob had not even tried to defend itself. Just a few shots. We had 2 men wounded, 2, and we had charged the main column of Napoleon's Grand Army. Tomassov muttered wearily, "What was the good of it?" I did not wish to argue, so I only just mumbled, "Ah, well." But the adjutant struck in unpleasantly. "Why, it warmed the men a bit. It has made me warm. That's a good enough reason. But our Tomassov is so humane. And besides, he has been in love with a Frenchwoman and thick as thieves with a lot of Frenchmen, so he is sorry for them. Never mind, my boy. We are on the Paris road now, and you shall soon see her." This was one of his usual, as we believed them, foolish speeches. None of us but believed that the getting to Paris would be a matter of years. Of years. And lo, less than 18 months afterwards, I was rooked of a lot of money in a gambling hell in the Palais Royal. Truth, being often the most senseless thing in the world, is sometimes revealed to fools. I don't think that adjutant of ours believed in his own words. He just wanted to tease Tomassov from habit, purely from habit. We, of course, said nothing, and so he took his head in his hands and fell into a doze as he sat on a log in front of the fire. Our cavalry was on the extreme right wing of the army, and I must confess that we guarded it very badly. We had lost all sense of insecurity by this time, but still, we did keep up a pretense of doing it in a way. Presently, a trooper rode up leading a horse, and Tomassov mounted stiffly and went off on a round of the outposts. Of the perfectly useless outposts. The night was still, except for the crackling of the fires. The raging wind had lifted far above the earth, and not the faintest breath of it could be heard. Only the full moon swam out with a rush into the sky and suddenly hung high and motionless overhead. I remember raising my hairy face to it for a moment. Then, I verily believe, I dozed off too, bent double on my log, with my head towards the fierce blaze. You know what an impermanent thing such slumber is. One moment you drop into an abyss, and the next you are back in the world that you would think too deep for any noise but the trumpet of the last judgment. And then off you go again. Your very soul seems to slip down into a bottomless black pit, then up once more into a startled consciousness, a mere plaything of cruel sleep one is then, tormented both ways. However, when my orderly appeared before me, repeating, "Won't your honor be pleased to eat? Won't your honor be pleased to eat?" I managed to keep my hold of it. I mean that gaping consciousness. He was offering me a sooty pot containing some grain boiled in water with a pinch of salt. A wooden spoon was stuck in it. At that time, these were the only rations we were getting regularly. Mere chicken food, confound it. But the Russian soldier is wonderful. Well, my fellow waited till I had feasted and then went away carrying off the empty pot. I was no longer sleepy. Indeed, I had become awake with an exaggerated mental consciousness of existence extending beyond my immediate surroundings. Those are but exceptional moments with mankind, I am glad to say. I had the intimate sensation of the earth in all its enormous expanse wrapped in snow, with nothing showing on it but trees with their straight, stalk-like trunks and their funeral verdure. And in this aspect of general mourning, I seemed to hear the sighs of mankind falling to die in the midst of a nature without life. They were Frenchmen. We didn't hate them, they did not hate us. We had existed far apart, and suddenly they had come rolling in with arms in their hands, without fear of God, carrying with them other nations, and all to perish together in a long, long trail of frozen corpses. I had an actual vision of that trail, a pathetic multitude of small, dark mounds stretching away under the moonlight in a clear, still and pitiless atmosphere, a sort of horrible peace. But what other peace could there be for them? What else did they deserve? I don't know by what connection of emotions there came into my head the thought that the earth was a pagan planet and not a fit abode for Christian virtues. You may be surprised that I should remember all this so well. What is a passing emotion or half-formed thought to last in so many years of a man's changing, inconsequential life? But what has fixed the emotion of that evening in my recollection so that the slightest shadows remain indelible was an event of strange finality, an event not likely to be forgotten in a lifetime, as you shall see. I don't suppose I had been entertaining those thoughts more than 5 minutes when something induced me to look over my shoulder. I can't think it was a noise. The snow deadened all the sounds. Something it must have been, some sort of signal reaching my consciousness. Anyway, I turned my head, and there was the event approaching me, not that I knew it or had the slightest premonition. All I saw in the distance were 2 figures approaching in the moonlight. One of them was our Tomassov. The dark mass behind him, which moved across my sight, were the horses which his orderly was leading away. Tomasov was a very familiar appearance, in long boots, a tall figure ending in a pointed hood. But by his side advanced another figure. I mistrusted my eyes at first. It was amazing. It had a shining, crested helmet on its head and was muffled up in a white cloak. The cloak was not as white as snow. Nothing in the world is. It was white more like mist, with an aspect that was ghostly and martial to an extraordinary degree. It was as if Tomassov had got hold of the god of war himself. I could see at once that he was leading this resplendent vision by the arm. Then I saw that he was holding it up. While I stared and stared, they crept on, for indeed they were creeping, and at last they crept into the light of our bivouac fire and passed beyond the log I was sitting on. The blaze played on the helmet. It was extremely battered, and the frost-bitten face, full of sores under it, was framed in bits of mangy fur. No god of war this, but a French officer. The great white cuirassier's cloak was torn, burnt full of holes. His feet were wrapped up in old sheepskins over remnants of boots. They looked monstrous, and he tottered on them, sustained by Tomasov, who lowered him most carefully onto the log on which I sat. My amazement knew no bounds. "You have brought in a prisoner," I said to Tomasov, as if I could not believe my eyes. "You must understand that unless they surrendered in large bodies, we made no prisoners. What would have been the good? Our Cossacks either killed the stragglers or else let them alone, just as it happened. It came really to the same thing in the end." Tomasov turned to me with a very troubled look. He sprang up from the ground somewhere as I was leaving the outpost, he said. I believe he was making for it, for he walked blindly into my horse. He got hold of my leg, and of course none of our chaps dared touch him then. "He had a narrow escape," I said. "He didn't appreciate it," said Tomasov, looking even more troubled than before. "He came along holding to my stirrup leather. That's what made me so late. He told me he was a staff officer, and then talking in a voice such, I suppose, as the damned alone use, a croaking of rage and pain, he said he had a favor to beg of me, a supreme favor. Did I understand him?" he asked in a sort of fiendish whisper. Of course I told him that I did. I said, "Oui, je vous comprends." "Then," said he, "do it. Now. At once. In the pity of your heart." Tomasov ceased and stared queerly at me above the head of the prisoner. I said, "What did he mean?" "That's what I asked him," answered Tomasov in a dazed tone, "and he said that he wanted me to do him the favor to blow his brains out. As a fellow soldier, he said. As a man of feeling, as a humane man." The prisoner sat between us like an awful gashed mummy as to the face, a martial scarecrow, a grotesque horror of rags and dirt, with awful living eyes, full of vitality, full of unquenchable fire, in a body of horrible affliction, a skeleton at the feast of glory. And suddenly, those shining, unextinguishable eyes of his became fixed upon Tomasov. He, poor fellow, fascinated, returned the ghastly stare of a suffering soul in that mere husk of a man. The prisoner croaked at him in French. "I recognize, you know. You are her Russian youngster. You were very grateful. I call on you to pay the debt. Pay it, I say, with one liberating shot. You are a man of honor. I have not even a broken saber. All my being recoils from my own degradation. You know me." Tomasov said nothing. "Haven't you got the soul of a warrior?" the Frenchman asked in an angry whisper, but with something of a mocking intention in it. "I don't know," said poor Tomasov. What a look of contempt that scarecrow gave him out of his unquenchable eyes. He seemed to live only by the force of infuriated and impotent despair. Suddenly he gave a gasp and fell forward, writhing in the agony of cramp in all his limbs. A not unusual effect of the heat of a campfire. It resembled the application of some horrible torture. But he tried to fight against the pain at first. He only moaned low while we bent over him so as to prevent him rolling into the fire, and muttered feverishly at intervals, "Tuez-moi! Tuez-moi!" Till, vanquished by the pain, he screamed in agony, time after time, each cry bursting out through his compressed lips. The adjutant woke up on the other side of the fire and started swearing awfully at the beastly row that Frenchman was making. "What's this? More of your infernal humanity, Tomasov," he yelled at us. "Why don't you have him thrown out of this to the devil on the snow?" As we paid no attention to his shouts, he got up, cursing shockingly, and went away to another fire. Presently, the French officer became easier. We propped him up against the log and sat silent on each side of him till the bugles started their call at the first break of day. The big flame, kept up all through the night, paled on the livid sheet of snow, while the frozen air all round rang with the brazen notes of cavalry trumpets. The Frenchman's eyes, fixed in a glassy stare, which for a moment made us hope that he had died quietly sitting there between us two, stirred slowly to right and left, looking at each of our faces in turn. Tomasov and I exchanged glances of dismay. Then de Castel's voice, unexpected in its renewed strength and ghastly self-possession, made us shudder inwardly. "Bonjour, monsieur." His chin dropped on his breast. Tomasov addressed me in Russian. "It is he, the man himself." I nodded, and Tomasov went on in a tone of anguish. "Yes, he. Brilliant, accomplished, envied by men, loved by that woman. This horror, this miserable thing that cannot die. Look at his eyes. It's terrible." I did not look, but I understood what Tomasov meant. We could do nothing for him. This avenging winter of fate held both the fugitives and the pursuers in its iron grip. Compassion was but a vain word before that unrelenting destiny. I tried to say something about a convoy being no doubt collected in the village, but I faltered at the mute glance Tomasov gave me. We knew what those convoys were like, appalling mobs of hopeless wretches driven on by the butts of Cossacks' lances back to the frozen inferno with their faces set away from their homes. Our two squadrons had been formed along the edge of the forest. The minutes of anguish were passing. The Frenchman suddenly struggled to his feet. We helped him almost without knowing what we were doing. "Come," he said in measured tones. "This is the moment." He paused for a long time, then with the same distinctness went on. "On my word of honor, all faith is dead in me." His voice lost suddenly its self-possession. After waiting a little while, he added in a murmur, "And even my courage, upon my honor." Another long pause ensued before, with a great effort, he whispered hoarsely, "Isn't this enough to move a heart of stone? Am I to go on my knees to you?" Again, a deep silence fell upon the three of us. Then the French officer flung his last word of anger at Tomasov. "Milksop!" Not a feature of the poor fellow moved. I made up my mind to go and fetch a couple of our troopers to lead that miserable prisoner away to the village. There was nothing else for it. I had not moved 6 paces towards the group of horses and orderlies in front of our squadron when— But you have guessed it. Of course. And I too, I guessed it, for I give you my word that the report of Tomassov's pistol was the most insignificant thing imaginable. The snow certainly does absorb sound. It was a mere feeble pop. Of the orderlies holding our horses, I don't think one turned his head round. Yes, Tomasov had done it. Destiny had led that de Castel to the man who could understand him perfectly. But it was poor Tomassov's lot to be the predestined victim. You know what the world's justice and mankind's judgment are like. They fell heavily on him with a sort of inverted hypocrisy. Why, that brute of an adjutant himself was the first to set going horrified allusions to the shooting of a prisoner in cold blood. Tomassov was not dismissed from the service, of course, but after the siege of Danzig, he asked for permission to resign from the army and went away to bury himself in the depths of his province, where a vague story of some dark deed clung to him for years. Yes, he had done it. And what was it? One warrior's soul paying its debt 100-fold to another warrior's soul by releasing it from a fate worse than death, the loss of all faith and courage. You may look on it in that way, I don't know. And perhaps poor Tomasov did not know himself. But I was the first to approach that appalling dark group on the snow. The Frenchman extended rigidly on his back, Tomassov kneeling on one knee rather nearer to the feet than to the Frenchman's head. He had taken his cap off, and his hair shone like gold in the light drift of flakes that had begun to fall. He was stooping over the dead in a tenderly contemplative attitude, and his young, ingenuous face, with lowered eyelids, expressed no grief, no sternness, no horror, but was set in the repose of a profound, as if endless and endlessly silent, meditation.